going to introduce knitting in the round. And you use this whenever you want to make something that's in a tube shape and you don't want to have a seam from sewing it together later. So you can see this, you just essentially knit it in a spiral. You just keep going around and around and around, and there's no seam to sew back together later. This is a fingerless glove. You would also use this on scarves, hats, sweaters, anything that's in a tube shape like that. And there are 4 different techniques that I'm aware of for how to do that. There are more detailed videos on most of them on the Cushion of Joy site. I want to start just by introducing the concept of knitting in the round. In this method, you would have a single circular needle that's exactly the right size for your project. So you would need a different size circular needle for a hat compared to a glove compared to a sweater, for example. But to do this, just to kind of understand the concept, you simply cast on the number of stitches you need, and the first step in any method is to make sure your stitches are not twisted. So for example, if these were coming around like this and back around, those are twisted stitches here and will not be good. You'll get kind of a Mobius effect in your knitting, which you don't want. Well, unless you do, but most of the time you don't want. So you start by making sure your stitches are lined up. One trick for connecting in the round is to cast on 1 stitch more than you need. So in this case, I've just done a simple long tail cast on. I did add 1 stitch. So here at the end then, I'm going to slip my working yarn's on the right needle. I'm going to slip the very first stitch from my left needle onto the right. And then just like you would with a bind off, you take that second stitch on the right and pull it up and off the needle. And that connects the whole project into the round. This is where you would then add a stitch marker so you can tell where the row starts. From here, it's very easy. You're just knitting around and around and around. Always, when you're knitting, you have to think about kind of scooching stitches up on the left and back on the right. In this case, you're moving them to travel all the way around the entire circular needle. The good thing about this particular of the 4 methods is that it's the easiest. You're not messing with any other needles, all of the others you have cables or needles or switching or something you have to do. This one you just keep knitting. It's very straightforward. The drawback is you have to have exactly the right size needle, and that's sometimes tricky. This is a really tiny one just for purposes of easy demonstration, but often if you're doing a sweater, of course, it'd have to be a much bigger project. So I would use this method anytime I can. This is always my first go-to method. Particularly for a hat, I would use like a 16-inch circular needle for a hat. This little tiny one I think is 9 inches. It was for that pair of gloves that I showed you. But if I can, I go with this method where I can use a single circular needle that's just the right size for my project. One final thing to note here is that you need to think about working on the outside of your project. So if I'm knitting here, my stockinette is going to start to come down like this, right? And when I put down my needles, you have to be very careful not to pick them up like this. You're now going, if you then start knitting, you'll be going back around the wrong direction. So you always think about knitting on the outside of the project. So let me show you some of the other methods. The next one is with double pointed needles. And again, there's a whole video on how to set this up, but I have a little sample here where you can see it coming down. And on this one, you spread the work over 4 needles, and it comes down kind of from between them, and then you knit with the 5th needle. You just reach across and knit across your next needle. And then when you get to the end, all of your stitches will have been transferred onto that right needle, and your left one is now empty. So the empty one goes in your right hand. Here's where my working yarn is. This is my next stitch to be worked, and you just go again. So again, the concept is very similar. You're just working around the circle. This is great for any teeny tiny projects. I would always use this, for example, on the thumb on those fingerless gloves, or you know, any kind of little tiny ornament, this is great. You can certainly do hats with these double pointed needles. They might need to be longer than this. These are just 6 inches. So you might need longer ones, like 8 inches, maybe even 10 inches to do a hat. But you can't really do a sweater on double pointed needles that I have found. It's really for smaller projects that are too small for a circle that's exactly the right size. That's when you'd want to use double pointed needles. So you might want to start a hat, for example, on a circular needle, like a 16-inch circular needle that's just the right size for your hat. But then once it starts decreasing near the top of the hat, you'd want to switch to one of these other 3 methods. So that was double pointed needles. The next one I'm going to show you is a traditional magic circle method. I actually have 2 different magic circle methods. This one uses one very long cable needle. Okay. And the way you do it, so normally, I have now moved the stitches. It wouldn't normally look like that at the end of a row, but you would move this needle so your stitches you're about to work are on the front needle. You just pull through the back needle, so you have some extra, and you knit all the way across. When I get to the end, I'll show you how that looks. So I have some extra cable on the right, I have some extra cable on the left. The project is sitting here in the middle. And it's kind of folded in half. You think about it being folded in half, you just keep flipping it over, is how I tend to think of it. So one benefit to this method is you probably have to own the fewest number of needles of any of these 4 options, because you can do almost any project that exists just on one very long magic loop. So here I am at the end. All the stitches are now on my right needle. I'm done with the left needle. I let it go. I flip it over. I now need to take and pull out the cable so that the stitches go onto the needle that was empty. And then I take the back needle, I pull it out, and I am ready to knit again. Okay, all set up again with my loops on both sides. So that is a method that is very commonly used. I have a friend of mine who knits constantly, and she uses long magic loop like this for absolutely every single project she ever does. Sweaters to little projects, she never uses straight needles, she never uses double pointed, she uses this for everything. The last method is another kind of magic loop where you actually use 2 sets of circular needles. And again, there's a video tutorial on the site for how to do this. So these are the stitches I'm ready for. So again, I push the needle up to the front, and then I take the end of the same circular needle. This is all the same circular needle. I get my yarn, and I knit across. Those needles I'm not using are making a lot of noise on this wooden table. This is the technique I always use for projects like sweaters, big projects. Okay, so now I'm done with that one. I just pulled that out. I'm done with that needle completely. I flip it over, and I use the other pair of circular needles, pull it through to the end, take the other end of that cable, and I'm off to knit again. It just keeps working that way. So you basically have half on each one. I find for a big project like a sweater that is the most convenient method. So the drawback to this method, even though I love it the best, is you have to essentially have 2 sets of cable needles for every project, and the tips generally need to be the same size. One radical tip is that it's really only the side that you're knitting with, the needle in your right hand, that has to be exactly the correct size. You could use one needle size smaller on the side that's going to hold the stitches that you're knitting off of. And so you could then put the correct size needle on the right hand needle for each of the 2 sides. I appreciate that might have been a little bit mind-bending. Those are the 4 methods that can be used, and you can see they really just vary depending on the project, but all of them allow you to knit in the round. I hope that's helpful.